The quiet was the initial thing that struck you. Not the quiet of death, but that deep, weighty stillness that falls over a location where a terrible reality has been interred while still breathing. It was the quiet of a residence that had consumed a hidden truth, slowly absorbing it across generations until the actual framework creaked beneath its burden. And inside that quiet, a query persisted, a murmur no one dared express aloud, yet everyone sensed. Why him? Why, from all the spirits laboring under the harsh Virginia sun, was a single young man selected from the fields and brought into the master's dwelling? The explanation was never uttered, never documented, never even suggested in the quiet discussions behind locked doors. It was a selection made in the oppressive warmth of an antebellum summer season. A choice that would fracture a family, expose a heritage constructed on unstable ground, and permanently transform the existence of Elias, the selected one. His tale is not about liberation, nor about basic servitude, but about a man compelled to exist at the very core of a fossard, where the atmosphere was dense with untold histories, and the darkness contained more reality than the illumination. And as we explore the suffocating closeness of that residence, you will discover yourself questioning, as Elias did, what unspeakable terror could drive a master to make such a selection, and why until now, the explanation was never recorded. Before we proceed with the narrative of Elias and Edmund Hatcher, if you're unfamiliar here, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a narrative like this one. Inform us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The year was 1847, and the atmosphere in Pennsylvania County, Virginia, lingered thick and moist, heavy with the aroma of developing tobacco and the silent burden of ancestry. The Hatcher estate, called Oakwood, extended across approximately 2,000 acres, its crops a mixed pattern of emerald and brown that reached to the horizon, interrupted solely by the dark, menacing line of distant woodland. At its core stood the primary residence, a magnificent two-level construction of painted brick, its pillars rising like quiet protectors, its windows looking outward with a nearly sad dignity. It was a residence constructed on aspiration, on the perspiration of enslaved work, and on a specific type of Southern satisfaction that concealed numerous transgressions. For generations, Oakwood had been a foundation of the district, its proprietor, Edmund Hatcher, a person of commanding presence, his name linked with wealth and an unyielding determination. He was a man whose look could diminish a weaker spirit, whose voice, though seldom elevated, held the force of complete command. However, even during his best years, there had always been a specific leanness to his characteristics, a darkness in his gaze that suggested a deeper, more individual anguish, a mystery eating at him internally. Now at 58, a widower for nearly 10 years. That darkness had deepened, carving lines of exhaustion and something akin to hopelessness around his lips. He walked through his magnificent residence like a spirit. His existence sensed more than observed, a quiet, brooding power that saturated every area of Oakwood. Elias, at 22, understood only the crops. His existence had been shaped by the steady motion of the blade, the sharp harsh smell of tobacco foliage, the unyielding sun beating down on his spine, and the companionship of mutual hardship in the enslaved quarters. He was a person of quiet power, his physique slender and tough from years of work. His palms rough, his face marked with the initial indications of a life lived under coercion. But underneath the surface, Elias possessed a cleverness that distinguished him, a sharp, watchful mind that absorbed every detail, every subtlety of the environment around him. He listened more than he talked, his dark gaze overlooking nothing, storing information with an accuracy that contradicted his absence of official schooling. His mom, Nora, had been a crop slave, a woman of quiet dignity and intense devotion, who had died when Elias was merely 12, abandoning him with little more than a faint memory of her soft caress and the continuing pain of her lack. He recalled her tales, murmured late in the night in the cramped hut, stories of strength and optimism, but also of the brutal truths of their life. Her passing had hardened him, not into resentment, but into a quiet determination, a resolve to survive, to persist, to stay unbroken. His nearest companion in the quarters was Abner, an older enslaved man, maybe 60 years old, whose complexion was like worn hide, and whose gaze held the insight of countless periods. Abner had observed generations arrive and depart, had seen the increase and decline of owners, and comprehended the complex, frequently harsh interaction between power and control. He was a quiet man, as well, but his quiet was distinct from Elias's. It was the quiet of someone who had discovered that phrases, when spoken carelessly, could be hazardous. Abner frequently shared his understanding in stories, in meaningful looks, in the subtle movements of his physical stance. He had taken Elias under his protection after Nora's death, instructing him the patterns of the earth, the silent regulations of endurance, and the significance of maintaining one's own privacy. Elias admired Abner profoundly, acknowledging in him a deep comprehension of the world that went beyond the limits of their enforced reality. Life in the quarters was a stark difference to the grandeur of the primary residence. The huts, basic and practical, clustered together in a gathering, their dirt floors cleaned tidy, their few belongings meticulously arranged. The atmosphere here was loaded with the aromas of wood fire, cooking vegetables, and unwashed bodies, marked by the noises of kids giggling, the low murmur of discussion, and the periodic mournful tune sung softly in the dusk. It was a realm of its own, distinct yet inseparably connected to the residence on the slope. Elias moved through it with a quiet elegance, his existence acknowledged with nods and brief meaningful looks. He was one of them, a crop worker fated for a life of endless work, his future as expected as the rising and setting of the sunlight. He had accepted this destiny, not with surrender, but with the quiet power of someone who grasped the constraints of his world. He had no fantasies, no grand aspirations of escape, solely the everyday fight for dignity and endurance. His inner world, though abundant with observation and silent contemplation, was carefully protected. A refuge against the severe realities of his external life. He was Elias of the crops, and that was all he had ever been. The idea that this thoroughly built normalcy, this expected pattern of his life was going to be destroyed would have been unthinkable, a concept too fantastical to consider. Yet the invisible forces of destiny, steered by the dark, unspoken wishes of a strong man, were already swirling, ready to extract him from the familiar ground and into the suffocating, decorated confinement of the owner's residence. The day the world changed for Elias started like any other, beneath a sky of relentless, cloudless blue. The sun shone with an oppressive strength, heating the ground and drawing drops of sweat from each forehead. The atmosphere shimmered above the lines of tobacco plants, and the rhythmic sound of tools against dirt was the sole sound that dared confront the buzzing of insects. Elias was deep in the crops, his spine hurting, his muscles burning, his attention concentrated on the job at hand, a contemplative state born of repetition and requirement. He moved with a effectiveness sharpened by years, his eyes scanning the wide green foliage for any indication of insect or disease. His fingers skillfully picking and cutting. The dirt, fine and red, covered his skin, combined with his sweat, and settled in the lines of his garments. Then a disturbance moved through the field. A quiet fell, not abrupt, but steady, like a wave withdrawing from the coast. Heads started to turn gradually, carefully, towards the border of the field where the route from the primary residence met the farmed territory. Elias, sensing the change in environment, halted, his tool resting against his shoulder. His look followed the others, and his breath halted in his throat. There, standing at the border of their world, was Edmund Hatcher. He was not alone. Beside him stood Thomas Hatcher, his boy, a person of 30, whose face was already set in expressions of irritability and inherited power. Thomas, with his pale skin and continuously narrowed gaze, was a harsh man in the particular, informal way of those who have never experienced genuine difficulty. He managed the everyday activities of the estate, his presence in the crops typically a sign of harsh remarks or quick discipline. But today his look was not one of fury, but of visible unhappiness, a tight-lipped frown that seemed to intensify the lines around his mouth. Behind them, the field manager, a large white man named Mr. Davies, stood a respectful space, his usual bluster replaced by an uncharacteristic unease. Edmund Hatcher, however, was the focus. He stood tall despite his years, his posture still authoritative, though his shoulders seemed to bear an invisible weight. He wore a fabric suit perfectly white against the dusty environment, a stark difference to the earth-stained garments of the field laborers. His gaze, typically fixed on some far, unseen horizon, now moved slowly across the lines of enslaved men and women, a deliberate, unsettling inspection. The quiet deepened, becoming nearly intolerable, broken solely by the distant sound of a crow and the frantic beating of Elias's own heart. Every man and woman in that field knew that when the owner came to the fields, it was never for a casual check. It was always for a reason, often a grim one. Edmund's look paused. It lingered, and then with a slow, deliberate motion, his arm lifted, his index finger pointing, not at an issue in the harvest, not at a particular job. He pointed directly at Elias. Elias felt a cold terror seep into his bones. He stood frozen, his tool still, his eyes wide, unable to understand. He looked around, half anticipating the finger to move, to indicate at somebody else, anybody else. But it stayed fixed on him. The field manager, Mr. Davies, moved forward, his tone a hesitant whisper. "Master Hatcher, is there a problem with Elias's work?" Edmund Hatcher did not lower his arm. His tone, when it emerged, was low, almost a murmur, yet it traveled across the silent field with an unsettling clarity. "No issue, Davies. Elias, you are to accompany me. You will work in the residence now." No clarification, no justification, just a statement delivered with the finality of a command. Thomas Hatcher moved uneasily, a low harsh sound escaping his throat. "Father, with all due respect, Elias is a field laborer. He understands nothing of house tasks. We have Ruth and the others." Edmund's gaze, sharp and cold, interrupted Thomas. "My choice, Thomas, it is finalized." The words were not a repeal, but a rejection of any debate. Thomas fell quiet, his face a facade of barely restrained anger. The other slaves in the field stayed still, their faces unreadable, but Elias felt the burden of their look, a particular, heavy quiet that was not of shock, but of something older, something akin to fear. They understood in their core that such a choice made without clarification was seldom a benefit. It was a sign, a division, a descent into an unknown that could be far more hazardous than the familiar hardships of the fields. Elias felt their compassion, their apprehension, and perhaps a flicker of morbid interest. He was being selected, and in their world, to be selected was often to be marked for a destiny no one desired. Elias slowly lowered his tool to the earth. His legs felt weighty as if attached to the ground. He took a deep breath, the atmosphere suddenly tasting metallic and strange. He looked at Abner, who stood a few lines away, his face a study in stoicism. But in Abner's gaze, Elias saw a flicker of deep worry. A quiet caution. "Come, Elias," Edmund Hatcher said, his tone now softer, almost persuading, a sound Elias had never heard directed at him previously. It was more disturbing than any instruction. Elias walked, his movements stiff, his mind a storm of confusion and terror. He abandoned the familiar scent of tobacco and soil, the comforting pattern of shared work, and walked towards the imposing shape of the owner, towards the grand residence that had always been a distant, unreachable presence. As he passed Thomas, he felt the younger Hatcher's hostile look, a tangible wave of bitterness that promised future difficulty. The walk to the residence was a haze. The world seemed to shift on its foundation. The sounds of the fields faded, replaced by the crunch of stones underfoot, the rustle of foliage in the groomed gardens, and the unsettling quiet of the owner's realm. He was guided through a side entrance, into the cool, shaded interior of the residence, a place he had only ever glimpsed from afar. The atmosphere inside was distinct, cooler, heavier, scented with wax, old documents, and something indefinable. Something that spoke of mysteries and long-held histories. Ruth, a house slave in her mid-30s, her face a blend of worry and a strange guarded compassion, met them in the rear hallway. She had worked inside the residence for years, her motions quiet and effective, her gaze accustomed to observing everything while appearing to observe nothing. She was a woman who comprehended the complex unspoken regulations of the residence, and her presence now was a quiet proof to the seriousness of Elias's new circumstance. "Ruth, show Elias to his space," Edmund Hatcher instructed, his tone echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. "He will attend me directly. Ensure he comprehends his responsibilities." Ruth nodded, her look meeting Elias's for a brief moment, a silent communication passing between them. A communication of caution, of mutual understanding, of the instability of his new role. She guided him down a narrow, poorly lit corridor, away from the more impressive rooms towards the rear of the residence. The floorboards creaked softly beneath their steps, each sound magnified in the oppressive quiet. His space was tiny, barely more than a cupboard, hidden away off the rear corridor, just steps from the owner's personal office. It held a narrow bed, a small wooden box, and a single high window that offered a fragment of sky. It was tidy, basic, and completely lacking of personal items. It was an area designed for functionality, for a presence that was intended to be unseen, unheard, yet constantly accessible. "This is where you'll rest," Ruth whispered, her tone low, almost secretive. "You'll be near Master Hatcher's office. He prefers to be able to summon you at any time." Her gaze held a deep, unsettling awareness. "You pay attention. You learn. You keep quiet and you observe." Elias nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. He looked around the tiny space, feeling the walls enclose him. The atmosphere was still heavy, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and cold, like dread. That first night inside the residence was a torment. The sounds were unfamiliar, intensified in the darkness. The creak of floorboards above, the distant chime of a long-case clock, the rustle of foliage outside the window, the soft, nearly unnoticeable murmur of voices from other areas of the residence. He lay on the bed, his body stiff, his mind racing, attempting to make sense of the inexplicable decision that had taken him from his familiar world. He felt like a bird caught in a decorated cage, the bars invisible but equally real. He could sense the presence of the residents around him, a living, breathing entity loaded with mysteries. And then he heard it, a soft, nearly unnoticeable sound from the owner's office just beyond his wall. A sigh, a clink of glass, and then a long drawn-out quiet. Elias knew with a chilling certainty that Edmund Hatcher was awake just as he was. And he knew, too, that the owner was watching him, even through the barriers, with an focus that had no title, and power that promised a future far more complex and terrifying than any he could have imagined in the sun-drenched fields. The explanation for his selection stayed a terrifying emptiness, a question mark hanging over his head, and the quiet of the residence seemed to mock his desperate need for understanding. Weeks bled into months, each day inside the residence a slow, deliberate dismantling of Elias's former life. The patterns of the residence were vastly distinct from the fields, a silent, complex dance of responsibilities and unspoken expectations. Elias learned rapidly, his watchful nature benefiting him. His main responsibility was to attend Edmund Hatcher directly, arranging his garments, preparing his morning tea, serving his meals in the eating room, and most often maintaining his private office. He became a presence, moving through the grand echoing rooms with a quiet effectiveness, his existence nearly unnoticeable, yet constantly there. He learned the layout of the residence, the creaking floorboards, the drafts that whispered through the long passages, the way the illumination shifted through the tall windows at various times of day. He learned the aromas, the faint, sweet decay of old flowers in the sitting room, the sharp smell of citrus polish, the dusty scent of neglected books in the library, and the ever-present strong aroma of Edmund Hatcher's tobacco. But more than the physical area, Elias learned the emotional terrain of the Hatcher family, a landscape as dangerous and unpredictable as any wilderness. Clara Hatcher, Edmund's girl, was a woman of 24, her attractiveness tinged with a deep sadness that seemed to stick to her like a fine haze. She moved through the residence with a quiet elegance, her gaze often distant, lost in some private realm. Elias observed her in the morning, sitting by the window, a book open in her lap, though she seldom seemed to read. Her schooling, unusual for a woman of her status in that period, seemed to have only deepened her unhappiness, making her intensely aware of the decorated cage she inhabited. She would occasionally offer Elias a small, nearly unnoticeable nod, a flicker of recognition that was more than any other white member of the household offered. Yet it was always accompanied by a look of deep pity, as if she saw a reflection of her own confinement in his new servitude. Thomas Hatcher, on the other hand, made no attempt to hide his bitterness. His cruelty, once aimed at the field laborers, now discovered a new, more personal focus in Elias. He would discover fault where there was none, give contradictory orders, and often simply stand and stare at Elias with a simmering hatred that was nearly tangible. Elias understood that Thomas saw him not just as a slave, but as an intruder, a symbol of his father's inexplicable preference, a danger to his own status as successor. Thomas's gaze, when they met Elias's, was always cold, always scheming, promising retaliation for a disrespect that Elias had not performed, but merely represented. Mrs. Dorothea Price, the housekeeper, a white woman in her late 50s, was a powerful presence. She had served the Hatcher family for over 20 years, her understanding of the residence and its residents comprehensive. Her face was a chart of tight lines and carefully controlled expressions, her gaze sharp and knowing, yet always guarded. She moved with a stiff, almost fragile dignity, her starched aprons rustling softly as she performed her responsibilities. Mrs. Price was an expert of careful silences, a woman who had discovered that survival in this residence sometimes meant swallowing what you knew, burying it deep within. She watched Elias with a blend of distrust and a strange, almost maternal worry. Her directions always exact, her warnings often delivered in concise, unclear phrases that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface. She was a guardian of mysteries, and Elias sensed that her understanding extended far beyond the everyday operation of the household. But it was Edmund Hatcher who stayed the central, most disturbing figure in Elias's new existence. The owner's routines became a predictable yet equally disturbing pattern. Every night without exception, Edmund would withdraw to his private office, locking the heavy oak door behind him. Elias would hear the soft click of the lock, a sound that marked the border between the public and private realms of the owner. Inside, Edmund would drink, often late into the night, the clink of glass and the occasional heavy sigh, the only sounds that escaped the thick barriers. On the wall of the office, above the impressive fireplace, hung a picture. It was of a woman, her features soft yet strong, her gaze possessing a luminous quality that seemed to follow Elias as he tidied the space. She was lovely, dressed in a basic, elegant gown, her dark hair pulled back from a high forehead. No one in the residence ever spoke her name. It was simply the picture, a silent, lovely ghost that presided over Edmund's solitary hours. Elias often caught Edmund staring at it, his face a facade of deep sorrow, a raw, unprotected emotion that was seldom observed in the owner's public manner. Most disturbing of all was the way Edmund sometimes halted in the middle of a phrase, his look drifting from whatever he was doing to settle on Elias. It was not a look of anger, nor of simple instruction. It was an powerful, nearly obsessive stare, an expression that had no title in the language of owners and enslaved men. It was a look of deep reflection, of seeking, as if Edmund were attempting to discover something in Elias's face, something he had lost, or perhaps something he desperately wished to see. Elias would stand still, his heart pounding, feeling the burden of that look, the unspoken questions behind it. He learned to keep his own face neutral, his gaze lowered, revealing nothing of the turmoil within. He became a blank surface, a mirror reflecting nothing back to the owner, hoping to deflect the unsettling power of that stare. Elias, with his sharp, watchful mind, started to keep a mental record of everything. The subtle changes in Mrs. Price's tone, the way Clara's gaze would linger on the picture, the venom in Thomas's voice, and most of all, the owner's unsettling look. He assembled fragments like a mosaic slowly forming in his mind, though the complete picture stayed elusive, shrouded in the residence's pervasive quiet. One Sunday, during the brief break permitted to the enslaved, Elias managed to sneak away to the quarters. He discovered Abner sitting outside his hut, carving a piece of timber, his movement slow and deliberate. Elias sat beside him. The familiar aromas of wood smoke and ground a welcome relief after the perfumed atmosphere of the residence. He spoke little, but Abner, with his deep understanding, sensed the change in him. "Child," Abner said, his tone a low rumble, not looking up from his work. "You've been selected for something." He stopped, the blade cutting a delicate curl from the timber. "And nothing that man selects comes without cost." Elias looked at the old man, his gaze seeking. "What do you mean, Abner?" Abner finally looked up, his ancient gaze meeting Elias's. "That residence, it ain't just brick and timber. It got its own type of appetite. And Master Hatcher, he got his own type of spirits. You in there now, Elias, you ain't just attending him. You attending his mysteries. And mysteries, child, they got a cost." He returned to his carving, the communication delivered, clear and chilling. Elias returned to the residence that night, Abner's words echoing in his mind. He was not just a servant. He was an observer. He was not just living in the residence. He was living inside its mysteries. And the owner's look, once merely unsettling, now felt like a marking him as part of a tale he did not yet comprehend. A tale that promised to be far more sinister than any he could have imagined. The quiet of the residence, once merely oppressive, now felt like a living thing, a suffocating covering woven from decades of unspoken truths, and Elias, now at its very center, was starting to feel its crushing weight. The turning point came on a Tuesday, a day that started like any other, yet ended with the world permanently changed for Elias. Edmund Hatcher had ridden into town for a meeting with the county judge, a rare absence that left the residence with an unusual, almost tangible lightness. Elias was tasked with his usual responsibilities in the office, cleaning the heavy mahogany desk, polishing the brass fixtures, and organizing the piles of records and letters. The space, usually filled with the owner's brooding presence, felt strangely empty, almost exposed. As Elias meticulously cleaned down the surface of the desk, his cloth caught on something. He looked down. A small, decorated drawer, usually kept secured, was open, barely a crack, but enough to catch the illumination. Edmund, in his hurry, had left it unlocked. A tremor ran through Elias. He knew instinctively that this was a border he should not cross, a forbidden area. Yet the magnetic draw of the unknown, the desperate need to comprehend the owner's unsettling look, the residence's pervasive quiet, was too powerful to resist. Abner's words, "Nothing that man selects comes without cost," echoed in his mind. He felt a deep sense of foreboding, but also an undeniable, almost reckless interest. His heart pounded against his ribs as he glanced around the empty space, then down the quiet corridor. No one. He took a deep, shaky breath, and with trembling fingers, gently pulled the drawer open further. Inside, nestled beneath a layer of yellowed parchment, lay a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were not official documents, not business letters. These were personal, intimate, their borders softened by time. Elias carefully, almost reverently, picked up the bundle. The paper felt fragile, delicate, as if it might crumble in his grasp. He untied the ribbon, his fingers fumbling slightly. The letters were written in a graceful flowing hand, the ink faded to brown. He observed the dates 1825, 1827, 1830, 1831. They were old, preceding his own birth by many years. He scanned the first one, his eyes rapidly interpreting the elegant writing. It was addressed to "My dearest Edmund," and signed simply with an initial, N. A cold wave washed over Elias. N. The initial resonated deep within him, stirring a memory, a whisper from his youth. He knew that initial. He had observed it, carved into a small, smooth stone his mother had kept hidden in her few belongings. Nora, his mother. He started to read, his breath catching in his throat. Each word a hammer strike to his carefully built understanding of the world. The letters spoke of a child, a secret child, conceived in a period of desperate hope and forbidden desire. They spoke of a promise Edmund had made, a promise of protection, of a future that would never happen. They spoke of a woman who understood with a chilling clarity that she would never leave the estate alive, that her destiny was sealed by the very secret she carried. One letter dated 1827 stood out, its words burning themselves into Elias's mind. My dearest Edmund, I write to you again, though I know these words may never reach your heart, only your grasp. The child grows within me, a living proof to our error, our brief stolen moments. You promised, Edmund, you promised he would be safe, that he would know a life beyond the crops. But I observe the way things are. I observe the fear in your gaze, the disgrace. You will not acknowledge him. You cannot, and I know my position. I know what will become of me and of him. If this truth ever sees the light of day, protect him, Edmund. If not for me, then for the part of you that lives within him. Do not let him suffer the fate of his mother. I pray for his spirit and for yours, though I fear yours is already lost to the darkness you have selected. Elias's hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped the letter. The words swam before his gaze, yet their meaning was terrifyingly clear. The child grows within me. He would know a life beyond the crops. The part of you that lives within him, and then the crushing realization. Do not let him suffer the fate of his mother, Nora, and the child him Elias. The atmosphere in the office suddenly felt thin, suffocating. The picture above the fireplace, the woman with the luminous gaze, seemed to look down at him with a knowing sadness. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and observed a faint, nearly unnoticeable similarity to his mother, a shared power in the set of the jaw, a similar depth in the gaze. Was this the woman Edmund truly adored? Or was she merely a symbol, a replacement for the forbidden love he had betrayed? He did not take the letters. He did not even think about it. The burden of them, the sheer devastating truth they held, was too immense to carry. With careful precision, his hand still trembling, he folded the letter he had read, placed it back with the others, and tied the faded blue ribbon exactly as he had found it. He gently returned the bundle to the drawer, pushing it closed until it clicked softly into place. He then cleaned down the desk again, his motions automatic, his mind spinning. He completed his responsibilities in a daze, the familiar objects of the office now filled with a sinister new meaning. The heavy desk, the leather-bound books, the very atmosphere of the space, all seemed to vibrate with the unspoken mystery. He moved through the remainder of the day like a spirit, his body performing its duties while his mind replayed the words of the letter, the terrifying implications of N. That night, Elias did not rest. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the sliver of moonlight that pierced his high window. The sounds of the residence, once merely unfamiliar, now felt like the murmurs of conspirators. Every creak, every distant murmur seemed to confirm the terrible truth he had uncovered. Edmund Hatcher's unsettling look, his inexplicable decision, the residence's pervasive quiet. It all merged into a single horrifying revelation. He was not just a slave selected for service. He was a mystery brought into the very center of the man who had created him, a living, breathing proof to a betrayal that had spanned decades. He was the child of Nora, the child of Edmund Hatcher. And the explanation he was inside the residence was not kindness, not functionality, but a desperate twisted attempt by his father to keep a living ghost near, a constant reminder of a promise broken, a life ruined, and a truth that, if ever spoken aloud, would destroy the very foundations of Oakwood. The first shadow had fallen, and Elias knew with a chilling certainty that his life and the lives of everyone in that residence would never be the same. The revelation of the letters, the undeniable truth of his parentage did not explode within Elias. Instead, it settled. A cold, heavy rock in the pit of his stomach, radiating outward to penetrate every part of his being. He now observed everything through a new terrifying lens. Edmund Hatcher's focus, once merely unsettling, was no longer random. It was not kindness nor simple functionality. It was the look of a man haunted. A man who could not stop looking at the face of a woman he had wronged, a woman now dead, a face he observed every time he looked at the son he had never acknowledged. Elias was not just a servant. He was a living, breathing accusation, a constant silent reminder of Edmund's deepest disgrace. The entire design of the residence took on a new sinister meaning. The grand columns, the polished floors, the heavy curtains. They were not just symbols of prosperity, but the elaborate facade of a lie. The quiet that permeated Oakwood was no longer just the quiet of a well-managed household. It was the suffocating quiet of complicity, of unspoken truths, of a mystery so deep it had twisted the lives of everyone within its barriers. Elias felt as though he were living inside a burial place, where the atmosphere was thick with the spirits of the past, and he, the unacknowledged son, was the most powerful spirit of all. He started to observe the others with an increased sensitivity, seeking confirmation, for any sign that they too knew, and slowly, subtly, the pieces started to fall into place. Ruth, the house slave, who had observed his arrival with a blend of compassion and fear, now seemed to regard him with a deeper, more profound sadness. In fragments, in hushed tones, when they were alone in the pantry or the laundry space, she started to confirm what Elias had suspected. "Nora, she wasn't always in the crops, you know," Ruth murmured one afternoon, her gaze darting nervously towards the entrance. "There was a period, long before you were born. She was in the residence, a seamstress, master hatcher. He had a preference for her work." Ruth's words were carefully selected, veiled, but the suggestion hung heavy in the atmosphere. She spoke of a period when things were distinct, a period before the current Mrs. Hatcher, a period when Nora had been closer to the owner, a period when the lines between owner and enslaved woman had blurred in the hazardous closeness of the residence. Ruth never said more, but her knowing looks, her sudden silences spoke volumes. She had been there or heard the murmurs from those who had. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, with her tightly controlled expressions, now seemed to carry an even heavier load. Elias noticed the way her look would sometimes linger on him, a flicker of something akin to guilt or regret in her usually neutral gaze. She would sometimes sigh, a deep, weary sound when Edmund was particularly withdrawn, or when Thomas was especially harsh. Elias understood that Mrs. Price knew. She had been with the family for decades, a silent observer to the unfolding drama, a guardian of the residence's darkest mysteries. Her careful silences were not just a practice. They were a protection, a survival method in a residence built on lies. Even Dr. Nathaniel Graves, the Hatcher family physician who visited the estate occasionally, seemed to carry a piece of the mystery. Elias observed the way Dr. Graves would sometimes exchange a brief, nearly unnoticeable look with Edmund, a look of mutual understanding that bypassed words. He noticed the physician's discomfort when Nora's name was unintentionally mentioned by an older field laborer, a quick, nearly unnoticeable tightening of his jaw. Dr. Graves, a man of science and discretion, was clearly aware of the family's hidden history, his medical understanding perhaps extending beyond physical conditions to the deeper psychological wounds of the Hatcher household. And Thomas, his simmering bitterness towards Elias now made chilling sense. Thomas knew, or at least suspected, his cruelty was not just the casual brutality of a owner, but the targeted malice of a man who observed a living insult to his legitimacy, a constant reminder of his father's transgression. His hatred for Elias was rooted in a deep insecurity, a fear that his own inheritance, his own claim to the Hatcher name, was somehow tainted by the presence of his unacknowledged half-brother. Clara, Edmund's girl, with her quiet sadness, also took on new meaning. Her schooling, her quiet rebellion against the limitations of her world, now seemed to be connected with the residence's mystery. As recalled her small, nearly unnoticeable nods, her looks of deep pity. He realized now that she had been attempting in her own way to protect him, to offer a silent comfort without ever being able to say why. She too was trapped by the mystery, a prisoner of her father's disgrace, and her sadness was the burden of a truth she could not speak. The burden of this knowledge, this shared unspoken history, pressed down on Elias. He walked through the residence performing his responsibilities, but his mind was a whirlwind of feelings. Grief for his mother, anger at Edmund, a deep sense of injustice, and a chilling fear for his own future. He was no longer just Elias of the crops. He was Elias, the mystery, the living embodiment of Edmund Hatcher's transgression. One night, as dusk bled into night, Edmund Hatcher summoned Elias to the office. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the scent of whiskey and tobacco. Edmund sat in his high-backed leather chair, a glass in his hand, his face shadowed by the dim illumination of the single lamp. Elias stood before him, his heart pounding, knowing this was not a summons for a simple duty. This was distinct. This was the moment. Edmund drank deeply, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He did not look at Elias directly. His look fixed on the flickering flame in the fireplace, the quiet stretched, long and agonizing, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant chirping of insects. Elias waited, his face neutral, his body stiff, prepared for whatever truth might finally appear. When Edmund finally spoke, his tone was low, rough, almost a murmur. But it was not about the letters. It was not about Nora. It was not about the truth. He spoke around it in the indirect, cautious language of men who cannot say what they mean, who are too consumed by disgrace and satisfaction to utter the words that would set them free. This land, Elias, Edmund started, his tone barely audible. It is more than just soil and harvests. It is an inheritance, a title. It is what a man leaves behind. He stopped, taking another long swallow of whiskey. My father, he built this from nothing. And I have kept it, maintained it, expanded it. His look finally shifted, not to Elias's gaze, but to his grasp, calloused and strong. A man, he owes something to what he has made, to his title, to his lineage. Elias listened, his mind racing, attempting to decipher the veiled confession. Edmund was speaking of inheritance, of lineage, of what a man owes. He was speaking of Elias without ever speaking his name. He was acknowledging the link, the shared lineage without ever uttering the words, son or father. There are duties, Edmund continued, his tone growing fainter, as if the words themselves were a physical weight. To the past, to the future, to structure, he gestured vaguely around the office at the books, the records, the symbols of his carefully built world. Structure must be maintained at any cost. Elias said almost nothing. He simply stood, a silent, unmoving presence absorbing every word, every detail, every unspoken truth. He understood. Edmund was not confessing. He was rationalizing. He was not seeking pardon. He was seeking understanding for the decisions he had made, the structure he had protected, even at the expense of a life, even at the expense of his own spirit. He was acknowledging Elias's life, his position in the inheritance. But only within the boundaries of the established structure, the structure that had denied him his name, his liberty, his rightful place. When Edmund finally dismissed him with a weary wave of his hand, Elias turned and left the office, the heavy oak door closing softly behind him. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement without words, a recognition without confession. The quiet that had once been an obstacle was now a shared area, a suffocating closeness born of a terrible unspoken truth. Elias knew with a chilling certainty that he was not just living in the residence. He was living inside Edmund Hatcher's awareness, a constant silent tormentor, a living spirit of a past that refused to stay buried. The burden of this quiet, this deep shared mystery was nearly unbearable. And Elias knew with a sinking heart that it would only grow heavier with time. If this tale is already making the hair on the back of your neck stand up, you're not alone. Hit that like button to let us know you're still with us. Leave your theories in the comments below and share this video with someone who loves dark history. Now, back to the residence on the hill. The months that followed, the unspoken acknowledgement in the office were the most hazardous Elias had yet endured. The fragile truce, the silent understanding between him and Edmund, seemed only to intensify the simmering resentments of others, particularly Thomas. The residence, once a place of oppressive quiet, now felt like a pressure vessel, its cracks slowly widening under the stress of its hidden truths. Thomas Hatcher, his face constantly red with anger and drink, started to actively move against Elias. His accusations grew bolder, his cruelties more focused. He would accuse Elias of minor thefts, a missing silver utensil, a misplaced record, knowing full well they were lies. He would deliberately assign Elias impossible duties, then criticize him for his inability. His ultimate goal was clear: to have Elias sent back to the crops, or worse, sold to another estate to remove the living insult to his own legitimacy. His disrespectful father. Thomas would shout, his tone echoing through the eating space during meals, his gaze fixed on Elias. He's not appropriate for house tasks. He belongs with the others. Edmund, however, would merely sigh, a weary, dismissive sound, and wave his hand, always protecting Elias, always keeping him near, a decision that only fueled Thomas's fury. Elias learned to anticipate Thomas's attacks, to deflect them with a quiet stoicism, knowing that any reaction would only provide Thomas with the justification he sought. He moved through the residence with an increased sense of alertness. Every shadow a potential threat, every corner a possible trap. The visits of Dr. Nathaniel Graves, once infrequent, seemed to become more frequent. Edmund's health, always unstable, seemed to be deteriorating more quickly. His thinness more obvious, his cough deeper. During one such visit, Elias, tasked with bringing fresh water to the office, overheard a fragment of conversation that chilled him to the bone. The entrance was slightly open, and Dr. Graves's tone, usually calm and measured, was laced with a rare urgency. "Edmund, Doctor," Graves said, his tone low. "You cannot keep him here indefinitely. It is unnatural and hazardous for everyone involved." Edmund's reply was a low rumble. "He stays. He is mine to keep." But the implications, Edmund, the danger, if word ever got out, if anyone ever truly assembled it. Dr. Graves's tone faded, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the atmosphere. "If anyone knew he was your son, you made a decision years ago to keep him near, not to liberate him, not to acknowledge him, just near. Like a mystery you can't destroy. But mysteries have a way of decaying, Edmund. They poison everything." Elias froze, the container of water heavy in his grasp. He heard Edmund's heavy sigh, then the clink of glass. "I know the dangers, Nathaniel. I live with them every day, but I cannot send him away. Not now." The conversation ended abruptly as Edmund coughed, a deep rattling sound. Elias quickly retreated, his mind spinning. Dr. Graves's words confirmed everything. Edmund had made a conscious decision years ago to keep Elias near, to have him within his view, a living penance, a constant reminder of his transgression, but never to truly acknowledge him. It was a twisted form of ownership, a desperate attempt to control a truth he could not face. The residence, already a storehouse of mysteries, started to show deeper cracks. Mrs. Price, the stoic housekeeper who had carried the burden of the Hatcher family's hidden history for decades, slowly started to fall apart. The stress of her knowledge, the constant alertness required to maintain the facade, was finally taking its cost. Her movements became less accurate, her silences more fragile. She started to make small errors, to overlook minor details. Her gaze often distant, haunted. One afternoon, Elias discovered her in the pantry, her grasp trembling as she polished a silver tray. Her gaze, usually so guarded, were wide with a desperate, nearly frantic fear. "It's all falling apart, Elias," she murmured, her tone barely audible. "The residence, it's diseased. And the owner, he's losing his control." She spoke of Nora, not directly, but in veiled references hinting at the injustice, the betrayal, the terrible cost paid for Edmund's satisfaction. She spoke of the picture of the letters of the child. She spoke of a decision made long ago, a decision that had poisoned everything. Elias listened, his heart heavy. He knew Mrs. Price was near to breaking, that the burden of her knowledge was becoming too great. He tried to offer a silent comfort, a steady presence, but he knew it was futile. The residence was indeed diseased, and its disease was infectious. A week later, Mrs. Price was discovered dead in her bed. The official reason announced by Dr. Graves was a sudden heart condition. But Elias knew better. He had observed the fear in her gaze, the way she had been swaying on the edge of revealing too much. He had heard the hushed, urgent discussions between Edmund and Thomas in the days leading up to her death. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Mrs. Price had been silenced, not with violence perhaps, but with a calculated, insidious pressure, a fear so deep it had stopped her heart. Her death was a stark, brutal reminder that the mystery that made him chosen also made him hazardous. He was not safe. The truth he carried was a weapon, and those who knew it or threatened to reveal it paid the ultimate cost. Clara Hatcher, her face pale and drawn, sought Elias out in the garden one night, her tone a low, urgent whisper. "Elias," she said, her gaze wide with genuine fear. "You must be careful, more careful than you have ever been. My father, he is capable of anything to protect his name. And Thomas, he is a serpent." She looked around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. Mrs. Price, her death was no mishap. Not truly. She knew too much. And now you are the one who knows. Her hand, usually so delicate, gripped his arm with surprising power. "Be careful, Elias, for your own sake. For Nora's sake." Her words spoken with such raw, uncharacteristic fear confirmed his darkest suspicions. Clara too was genuinely frightened, not just for herself but for him, but for the cracks in the residence were widening, and Elias knew that the ground beneath his steps was becoming increasingly unstable. He was living on borrowed time, a piece in a deadly game. And the truth he carried was a ticking bomb threatening to shatter the entire structure of Oakwood. The death of Mrs. Price, swift and chillingly convenient, solidified Elias's understanding of the true nature of the residence and the man who ruled it. The mystery was not merely a burden. It was a living, breathing thing that demanded sacrifices. And Elias, the unacknowledged son, was now at its very center. He understood that his knowledge was not just power, but a deep vulnerability. He could not speak it. He could not act on it. The law, the society, the entire brutal design of Virginia in 1855 made the truth he carried not just unspeakable, but potentially deadly. To reveal it would be to invite destruction, not just for Edmund, but for himself, for Clara, for anyone who dared to challenge the established structure. He moved through his days with a new deep sense of isolation. The other house slaves, sensing the shift in the residence's atmosphere, avoided him, their looks wary, their murmurs hushed. He was marked, set apart, not just by Edmund's decision, but by the terrible knowledge he now possessed. One afternoon, while tidying Edmund's office, his look fell upon a loose floorboard beneath the owner's heavy desk. It was nearly unnoticeable, a slight discoloration in the timber, a faint gap. His heart quickened. He remembered the letters, the hidden drawer. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of the board. With a careful, almost exact precision, he pried it open. Beneath, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a single document. It was a legal paper, its parchment yellowed with age, its ink faded. Elias carefully unrolled it. It was a deed of manumission, a document that would have legally recognized Elias, granting him his liberty, and more shockingly acknowledging his parentage. The names were there, clear as day. Elias, son of Nora, and of Edmund Hatcher. The date was 1835, when Elias would have been 10 years old, but it was unsigned, unfiled, never submitted. Edmund Hatcher had written it. He had held it in his grasp. He had considered it. And then he had hidden it away, unable to destroy it, but equally unable to act upon it. It was a proof to his deep internal struggle, his desperate battle between a flicker of awareness and the crushing weight of societal expectation, of satisfaction, of disgrace. He could not bring himself to acknowledge his son, to shatter the carefully built facade of his life, to risk the scandal that would surely follow. But he also could not bring himself to completely remove the truth, to destroy the only legal recognition of Elias's life. So he had buried it, like so many other truths, beneath the floorboards of his office, a silent, agonizing proof to his cowardice and his enduring twisted attachment to the mystery. Elias held the document in his grasp, the paper rustling softly, a ghost of enchance, a phantom future. He thought of his mother, Nora, her quiet power, her intense devotion, her desperate plea in the letters for her son to know a life beyond the crops. He thought of the 22 years of his life, lived in the shadow of a mystery that was always about him, a truth that had defined his very life without his knowledge. He thought of the injustice, the deep, soul-crushing injustice of it all. This piece of paper, this unsigned decree, represented everything he had been denied, everything his mother had hoped for him. A wave of deep grief mixed with a cold, burning anger washed over him. He could have been free. He could have had a name, a recognized ancestry. He could have had a life. But Edmund Hatcher, his father, had chosen disgrace over honor, satisfaction over justice, silence over truth. He stood there for a long time. The document in his grasp, the burden of it immense. He could take it. He could expose Edmund. He could shatter the residence, the family, the entire carefully built world of Oakwood. But what would it gain him? A brief violent disruption followed by what? Retaliation. A life on the run. The destruction of Clara's fragile peace. The confirmation of Thomas's darkest fears. In this world, in this period, a black man, even one with a white father, had no legal recourse, no true justice. The truth in this context would not liberate. It would only destroy. With a heavy heart, Elias carefully folded the document, placed it back in its oilcloth wrapping, and returned it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard. He pressed the board back into place, ensuring it was perfectly aligned, leaving no trace of his discovery. He said nothing. He spoke to no one. But something in him was now permanently distinct. The silence he carried was no longer someone else's burden, someone else's disgrace. It was his own decision. He had observed the truth, held it in his grasp, and consciously decided to bury it again, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding of the world he inhabited. He would carry this truth not as a weapon, but as a protection, a silent knowledge that would direct his path. The burden of the truth was immense. But Elias, created in the crucible of Oakwood mysteries, was now strong enough to bear it. Knowing that some battles were not fought with words or documents, but with an enduring, silent determination, just when we thought we understood what Edmund Hatcher was hiding, the truth reveals itself as something far more disturbing than any of us could have imagined. If this tale is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss tales like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The year 1861 arrived like a storm, dark and threatening, bringing with it the thunder of distant weapons and the chilling winds of war, the fragile peace that had long masked the deep cracks in American society. And within the Hatcher household, finally shattered, the Civil War started, and its brutal reality started to tear at the very fabric of Oakwood. The estate, once a symbol of wealth, started to break apart. The crops, once meticulously tended, showed signs of neglect as the workforce dwindled. Some fleeing north, others pressed into service for the Confederate cause. The sounds of distant conflicts, the rumors of battles fought and lost, permeated the atmosphere, replacing the familiar patterns of estate life with a pervasive sense of fear. Thomas Hatcher, fueled by a powerful mix of Southern satisfaction, inherited cruelty, and a desperate need to prove himself, eagerly enlisted with the Confederacy. He rode off to war with a flourish, leaving behind a path of debt, an inheritance of petty tyrannies, and a residence that breathed a collective sigh of relief at his absence. His departure, however, left Edmund Hatcher even more isolated, more exposed, clinging to the remnants of his authority with a desperate, nearly pathological grip. Clara Hatcher, however, found her quiet rebellion transformed into active, albeit secretive resistance. Her sadness, once a passive lament, now fueled a quiet determination. She had over the years developed a network of contacts, abolitionist supporters in the North, and courageous individuals within Virginia who believed in a distinct future. Under the cover of night, with a quiet courage that contradicted her delicate appearance, she started to help several enslaved individuals from Oakwood and neighboring estates escape north, directing them to safe houses, providing them with what little resources she could spare. Elias, observing her secretive movements, her hushed discussions, understood her purpose, and a silent mutual respect grew between them. A shared understanding of the moral decay that permeated their world. He never spoke of what he observed, but his silent acknowledgement was a comfort to Clara, a rare moment of shared truth in a world of lies. Edmund Hatcher, now aged and diminished, seemed to shrink within his grand residence. The war, the loss of his son to its uncertain embrace, the decreasing productivity of his land, the erosion of his social standing. All these external pressures seemed to accelerate his internal decay. He clung to Elias with a nearly pathological desperation. Elias was no longer just a servant, no longer just a mystery. He was a lifeline, a constant presence in a world that was rapidly falling apart around Edmund. He was the only one who stayed, the only one who observed to Edmund's slow, agonizing collapse. The owner's once formidable presence was now reduced to a fragile, trembling figure. His grasp, once strong and commanding, now shook uncontrollably. His gaze, once sharp and piercing, were clouded with a deep weariness, a deep-seated fear. He spent most of his days in the office, drinking heavily, staring at the picture of the unnamed woman, his mind lost in the maze of his past. One particularly bleak night, as the sounds of distant gunfire rumbled like an angry god across the Virginia landscape, Edmund Hatcher summoned Elias to the office. The space was dim, lit only by a single flickering candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the barriers. Edmund sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, his breath shallow. He looked utterly broken, a man stripped bare of his satisfaction, his authority, his very being. Elias, Edmund rasped, his tone barely a murmur thick with whiskey and despair. He gestured vaguely towards the decanter. Elias poured him another drink, his motions automatic, his heart heavy. He knew this was it, the final unraveling. Edmund drank deeply, then fixed his look on Elias, his gaze wide, nearly childlike in their vulnerability. The war, it takes everything. Everything a man constructs. Everything he believes in. He stopped, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. My father, he would be ashamed. Ashamed of what I have become, of what this place has become. He spoke of Nora, not by name, but in veiled references, in fragmented sentences that painted a picture of a desperate, forbidden love, a moment of weakness, a promise made in haste and broken in fear. He spoke of the child, of the burden of his life, of the disgrace, the fear of scandal, the need to preserve his name, his inheritance, his structure. It was not a confession, not an apology, but a desperate, broken attempt at a connection that he had spent 30 years refusing to build. He was attempting in his final moments of clarity to explain, to rationalize, to unburden himself of the crushing weight of his mystery. She was lovely, Elias, Edmund murmured, his look drifting to the picture, then back to Elias's face. Strong, fierce, like you. He reached out a trembling hand as if to touch Elias's arm, but stopped short, his hand hovering in the atmosphere, unable to bridge the gap of their relationship. Then, in a moment of terrible closeness, a slip of the tongue born of deep despair, Edmund Hatcher called Elias by his mother's name. Nora, he breathed, his tone barely audible, his gaze fixed on Elias's face as if observing her reflection there. My Nora. He halted himself abruptly, his gaze widening, a flicker of disgrace returning to his look. He closed his gaze, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. Elias looked at the old man, his father in the dim flickering illumination of the office. He said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, not because he felt no feeling, but because some truth spoken aloud in a world like this did not liberate anyone. They only destroyed. They shattered the fragile peace, ignited the fires of retaliation, and brought down the anger of a society built on lies. He understood that Edmund's brokenness was his own punishment, a torment far greater than any Elias could inflict. He understood that the silence he had carried for so long was not just a burden, but a protection, a means of survival. He had observed to the collapse of a man, the unraveling of an inheritance, and the final agonizing confession of a mystery that had consumed a lifetime. He stood there, a silent, unmoving guard, watching the last embers of Edmund Hatcher's satisfaction flicker and die, knowing that the true cost of the owner's decision was not just his own life, but the very spirit of the man who had made it. The war ended in April of 1865, not with an explosion, but with a weary sigh that swept across the ravaged landscape of Virginia. Emancipation. A word once murmured in hushed tones, now rang out with the power of a trumpet, shattering the chains of generations. For Elias, it was not a sudden burst of joy, but a quiet, deep shift, a lifting of an invisible weight he had carried his entire life. The world, once rigidly defined, now stretched out before him, vast and uncertain, yet filled with the terrifying promise of self-determination. On a morning in late April, beneath a sky that was finally clear and blue, Elias walked off the Hatcher estate. He took nothing with him. Not the letters still hidden in the locked drawer of the office. Not the unsigned deed of manumission still buried beneath the floorboards, not a single object from the residence, no memento of his years spent living inside its suffocating mysteries. He left everything where it was, exactly as he had found it, a silent proof to the truths he had uncovered, and the decisions he had made. He carried only the garments on his back, the calluses on his grasp, and the deep, indelible knowledge carved into his spirit. He walked away from Oakwood, from the crops, from the residents, from the spirits, and from the man who had been both his owner and his father. He walked towards an unknown future. A free man carrying a silence that was now finally his own. Edmund Hatcher died 6 weeks later in early June, officially of a lung condition. A body worn out by years of drink, despair, and the crushing weight of his unconfessed sins. His death was quiet, almost unnoticed amidst the chaos of a defeated South. The residence, now truly empty of its owner, seemed to exhale, its oppressive quiet replaced by a mournful echo. The office was eventually cleared, its contents catalogued and sold. The locked drawer was found, empty. No one knew who had emptied it or when. The letters, the picture, the hidden document, all were gone, vanished into the currents of history. Their mysteries finally laid to rest, or perhaps carried away by grasp that understood their true value. Clara Hatcher, her spirit finally unbound by the death of her father and the end of the war, left Virginia shortly after Edmund's passing. She sold her meager inheritance, severed all ties with the remnants of her family, and disappeared north, never to be heard from in Pennsylvania County again. Her quiet rebellion had found its ultimate expression in freedom. A life lived far from the shadows of Oakwood. Thomas Hatcher returned from the war. A broken man, his confidence replaced by a haunted emptiness. He tried to salvage what remained of the estate, but the land, like the family, was too fractured to heal. He sold off parcels piece by piece until nothing was left of the once grand Oakwood. He too eventually disappeared into history, his name fading into the records of a lost cause. His cruelty ultimately consuming him, and the explanation: Edmund Hatcher chose Elias to live inside the residence. It was never written down, not in any district record, not in any church register, not in any letter that survived the ravages of time and war. It died with Edmund. A mystery too shameful, too deep, too hazardous to ever commit to paper. Or perhaps it walked off the estate on that April morning, a truth finally belonging only to itself, carried in the heart of a man who had learned that some tales are best left unspoken, their power residing not in their revelation, but in their enduring chilling silence. And so the residence on the hill, stripped of its mysteries, slowly crumbled. A monument to a truth that was never written down. A proof to the terrifying power of human decision and the enduring haunting question of why. What do you think of this tale? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more tales of dark American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next tale.